which is why people go to church. Not every church-going person is out to put women in the kitchen and Jews in the oven and put away gays and all that. Some are. I don't think the majority. And it's the ones who quietly had faith that I wanted to investigate. And they're the ones that I discovered in India. And so I went, I said 180 degrees, we think it was the most interesting thing. And from, as I said, in a non-denominational way, but in a true way, believing that ultimately all of this makes sense. Even evil. And that's really coming back to healing. What's wonderful about religion that I discovered is how it is a self-reinforcing mechanism, which you don't find as much in the secular world. The average urban, secular North American, who, believes in democracy, believes in art, believes in his or her family, those are all strong pillars. But they do very little when you're struck by tragedy. The death of a child because of a car accident, because of leukemia, leaves the secular mind numbed with pain and with no real answers. With no real answers. What's interesting about the religious mind is the religious mind that is struck by tragedy somehow managed to digest that tragedy and keep on going. So, the religious mind, and religious people suffer as much as non-religious people, they just deal with it differently. And what's interesting about the religious person, the person of faith, is if a good thing happens to them, it's a reward. A good thing happened to me, thank you, whatever, Jesus, Buddha, Allah, whatever you want. And if a bad thing happens to them, oh, it's a challenge. I must have more faith. And if it's a real tragedy that lives, the death of someone in the family, someone very close, or a tragedy with themselves, and then they say, at one point, the standard religious response is, well, what do I do? I don't understand why this is happening to me. I'm a good person. Why is a bad thing happening to me? The ultimate religious answer is, you don't know because you're too small. But someone else does, someone bigger than you. And so let go. See, that's a key difference with the reasonable approach. The reasonable mind wants an answer. The reasonable mind does not give up. Which is why science has been so triumphant, because of all these dogged scientists who don't accept not knowing, or all these engineers and all that, they don't accept not knowing, and we have all these little gadgets that we live with that vastly improve our lives. They don't give up. The religious mind, at one point, does give up in terms of reason. So the religious mind says, why does my daughter have leukemia? It says, well, I don't know. But it's somehow in a way that I don't understand, it must make sense. God, however way that person might interpret God, or name that God somehow wants my daughter to have leukemia and to die of it, and I really hate that, but I'll accept that. And so it's a self-reinforcing mechanism in those who have that kind of faith. And that means they can keep on going. I've generally found for a few years in Montreal, I volunteered in palliative care. If you call that here, if you call it palliative care or hospice care, care for the dying. Every Thursday morning I'd go to this place where these people were dying, and I just try to do whatever I could to help them. Everything from massaging their feet, to washing their hair, to getting something to drink, to just chatting with them. And I generally found that those that had some kind of otherworldly belief found it slightly easier to let go. Because of course when you die, you have to let go of absolutely everything. Whereas the secular people, and I'm sort of generalizing here, were just terrified and dumb. They just couldn't deal with it. Even in their last moments, they still were frozen numb by incomprehension. Which is not to say that you believe in something there, you're going to be easy to die, of course not. But nonetheless, mechanisms in there that somehow make you let go, stand back a little bit. And as a result of the life of writing Life of Pi, I personally have found it much easier to not sweat the small things, not worry about the small things. Because after all, nearly every religion that I'm familiar with, whenever they meet, and religion is profoundly social, whenever you meet, it's to discuss deep things. So, in Christian churches, we talk about death every single Sunday. Every single Sunday, death is brought up in one form or another. And that's refreshing, because if you're familiar with death, you will value life more. Whereas, in the secular world, death is never discussed. Death is pushed further and further away. We're terrified of aging and dying in the secular world. We hide it with cosmetic surgery, with clothing that makes us look young, with all kinds of mechanisms to deny it. We're terrible at dying in the secular world. We deny it as much as possible, which I think leads to lives of tragic frivolity. We sort of, amuse ourselves to death. Whereas in the religious world, in whatever denomination, once a week, there's a discussion of things that go deeper. And I find it helps give a certain perspective on our lives. And that's certainly what I have found with that. And then the last one before I go to what I was going to talk about, the Canadian Prime Minister. My subsequent novel, which didn't do as well, was called Beatrice and Virgil. And I'm not Jewish, but I've always been interested in the Holocaust. When I talk about monumental tragedies, the Holocaust is the defining one for the 20th century. As a kid growing up, I read books on the Holocaust, I saw movies on the Holocaust, and it always struck me. Not just because it was a monumental tragedy, and it was anomalous in terms of monumental tragedies. Because, when you're a kid, eventually one war resembles every other war. And sure enough, the mechanisms of war are quite similar. Whether it's the 7-Day War, the 100-Year War, or the Second World War, essentially you have competing forces competing for the same resources. They can't all have them, so they go to war. There's a winner, there's a loser. And you sort of change the kinds of weaponry they use and the cast of characters. But essentially the mechanics of war is very simple. Anyone who has a sibling understands war. The Second World War is a fight with my brother writ large. We understand the mechanism. Sure enough, kids play war. But kids don't usually play the Holocaust. The Holocaust was different, and even as a kid I realized, this is not like a regular war, because after all, the Germans and the many acolytes weren't killing enemies, they were killing their own fellow citizens. They were killing people who spoke German like them, paid taxes, won Nobel Prizes for them, went to war with them in the First World War. It was kind of crazy. It was like, killing your own friend. Why would you do that? So it stayed with me as psychologically bizarre to my mind. And because of that, it stayed with me, so I kept on reading about it. And the reason I decided to write about it after Pi, as I said, I was looking for something I'm looking for something to understand. And in this case, I noticed something rather odd with the way the Holocaust is portrayed. Now, compare the treatment of war, let's say in literature or in film, with the treatment of the Holocaust. We treat war any which way we want. We're comfortable telling adventure stories, sort of John Wayne movies about war. We're quite willing to watch documentaries on war. We're quite willing to invent stories about war. And the classic literary one I want to give you is The Red Badge of Courage by Stephen Crane. A classic that Stephen Crane wrote age 22 or 24 without having ever fought in battle. The Red Badge of Courage is a complete fiction. It's an invention on the part of Stephen Crane. Yet, Stephen Crane or Stephen Hart? It is Stephen Crane, I'm not so sure. So it's Stephen Crane. And yet it's held to be a masterpiece of war literature. You don't have that kind of inventive liberty with the Holocaust. There's very few novels about the Holocaust that are genuine novels. Usually they're either based on someone's biography or they're even autobiographical. And they're rooted in facts. So most Holocaust novels very closely adhere to the jargon of historical realism. So in other words, a novel that reads like something that really did take place 60 years ago in Central Europe. Of course, there's nothing wrong with that. But why do we limit ourselves to that genre? Whereas with war, we do anything. Everything from war comedies, where war is the background for a comedy, or war romances, where the story of the war is just an excuse for, how a boy from Louisiana meets a girl from Normandy. For example, we're also very comfortable talking about war. The war in Iraq a few years ago, everyone was happy as citizens to talk about it quite freely. People are much less comfortable talking about the Holocaust, especially if they're not Jewish. So there's, in Beatrice and Virgil, I was interested in looking at why is that so? Why do we limit how we look at the Holocaust? Now you'll say, of course, because it was tragic. 1/4 of the victims of the Holocaust were children. That's a tragedy. Well, the Second World War cost the lives of 20 million people. By conservative estimates, 20 million people. That's also a tragedy. And that, by the way, is only in the Allies. That's excluding the German and the Italian deaths. 20 million. So one's, in terms of simply the death of lives, is as great, more of a tragedy than the Jewish Holocaust. And yet one we talk about very freely, one we don't. And my point in all that is that do we lose something by limiting how we represent the Holocaust? The fact that we talk any which way about war, do we not gain something from that? Do we not bring it closer to us? And I found that we did, because I found that